Welcome to a new round of Decision Makers, our frequent conversations with policymakers, prognosticators, and experts who offer us a wide range of the latest insights and perspectives on a wide range of issues. Christopher Towler now joins us, Associate Professor of Political Science and Black Studies at California State University in Sacramento. He's also Director of the Black Voter Project and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics. You're wearing quite a few hats, Professor. You can find him on BlueSky at blackprofcct. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation here.
Appreciate it. I'm real curious. Let's talk about the Black Voter Project and also the journal. So what are these projects designed for and for whom?
So the Black Voter Project comes out of almost a personal want in graduate school to study Black public opinion and political behavior using, really good, accurate, reliable data. And even though I was going through grad school during the Obama years, surprisingly, it was hard to find large and data sets that were specific to the Black community and really designed to collect attitudes and opinions of Black people. And so coming out of graduate school, one of my first sort of projects was to do a pilot study where I collected a national survey of Black voters that has, spawned into this multi-year, multi-survey project now where I've this last election cycle had the opportunity to collect a multi-wave longitudinal study of Black voters with some of the waves, having as many as 2,000 Black participants in the survey, something that really is unheard of and unfounded these days, especially when I've really taken the time to make these surveys rigorous and academic as well, so that they can be used not only to just study top lines and crosstabs of Black public opinion, but actually for academic research, right? And make it through the peer review process and upstand to those standards. And so the survey project has been something that I've really pushed along on my own as a way to hopefully one day offer some data as to what happened in the Black community, what Black people are thinking, saying, how they're behaving using empirical data for this time period. Along with doing that, I've joined a co-editor to run the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, a Cambridge University Press academic journal, which has a mission of really publishing academic work that is outside of sort of the mainstream traditional white centered politics. And so this journal has been around for almost a little over 10 years now. And it's spawned out of a need to have a subfield journal specific to race and ethnic politics when many of the mainstream academic journals were not publishing this type of work at a high rate or were not even considering this work relevant to political science. And so since then, the journal has become widely popular, and it's something that I pride myself as being a part of now, and an honor to serve as one of the editors in chiefs, pushing out very, very important and rigorous academic work on race and ethnic politics.
Yeah, and so going back to the Black Voter Project, that's been a part of your meticulous exploration of Black voters for some time now, and because we watch some of that commentary, some of that analysis on social media that you've been presenting, and so like to get your take on a very big question, of course. What's the mindset of Black voters right now in a moment like this?
Yeah, this is a looming question that I think is really important to have data to speak to it. There's a lot of memes out there about Black people sort of taking a back seat, or watching people in the find out stage now that the second Trump presidency is underway, and the data to many ends sort of backs up this sentiment. When I surveyed people throughout the campaign, there was a growing sense of attachment and positivity towards the Democratic Party. We asked participants all the way back in April when Biden was still the nominee, how welcoming the Democratic Party was to Black people, and about 28% found that the party was extremely welcoming. That rose to 42% in October, right before the election, with Harris as the nominee. And so there was this increase in perception of the Democratic Party as welcoming to Black people. However, we asked people again in December following the election, and that number dropped from 42 back down to 35%, reversing course. And so there's the numbers back up this idea that sort of Black people are disillusioned with Democrats right now, sinking more back into apathy rather than action. And furthermore, we asked people following the election whether a second Donald Trump presidency would motivate them to become more committed to politics, or whether it would prove exhausting and really if they just wanted to be left alone. And only 23% of respondents, Black respondents, said it would motivate them, where 43% said, they pretty much felt exhausted and wanted to be left alone after the election. And when we look at some of the gender dynamics here, a whole 51% of Black women said that a second Trump presidency would prove exhausting for them. And so the data backs up sort of what's going on there, some of this crosstalk and anecdotes about the Black community really being hit hard by this election and wanting to take a step back.
That's fascinating, that Black voters, members of the Black community would want to step back, would be exhausted in a moment like this. Especially when we think of collective experiences or generational experiences over many decades, regarding the Black experience, right? So taking like the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, the push to pass major laws like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, it's not within the Black DNA to get exhausted like that on major issues, to, like destroying Jim Crow. It's just not. So it's a uh, very fascinating take or perspective or moment that we're going through. I'm wondering here, I'm curious here. I mean, does that have a lot to do with civic literacy or the lack thereof, right? Black voters, or a lot of Black voters out there just not understanding this is how this process works. This is how much voting contributes to making a change to what the current political climate is.
I think it's twofold. I think you do have some sort of unlikely or low information voters who might have sat out this election cycle when they voted either in 2020 or maybe for President Obama in his first or second term. And we see as more and more turnout data is released that Black turnout was down in 2024 compared to 2020. And in some states like Georgia, Black voters were the only group to see a drop in turnout, where white voters, Asian American voters, Latino voters all saw slight increases in turnout. And so there's already this sort of looming sentiment that Black people were not as engaged this election cycle as in the past. And so there's that group of unlikely voters who are really just taking another step back, right? They were on the fence as to whether they were going to participate this year. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And after this election, they're like, I really didn't pay attention to politics much before this, so I'm really going to check out now. It's really not worth my time. And then you have the other group of Black voters who is engaged, who does follow politics, who knows what's going on, right? And typically is more knowledgeable and sophisticated in their political takes, who might not see politics or voting as useful as in the past, or is just, as was, the data suggests, exhausted by the political environment. And when we actually talk to Black voters, so in addition to the survey work, we do a lot of focus groups where we actually get individuals together and have conversations. They're directing their energy to other places. And so it's not that those who are high propensity or are likely, involved in politics aren't stepping back from politics. They just don't necessarily see voting and voting for the Democratic Party as a priority right now. And they're moving towards maybe looking at their local elections or focusing on what's going on in the educational systems in their school, or trying to build up community organizations to protect housing and the environment around Black communities across the nation. And so, right, you do have this group of voters who is kind of not always political, who might have less information about the importance of elections, stepping back. But we also see, even amongst the high propensity voters across the country and in places like Detroit, right, where you have significant amount of Black voters who are always involved in politics at the local level, shifting their energy away from the national politics and specifically the Democratic Party, more towards local and community politics and way to affect things on the ground where they live.
You kind of touched on, you hinted at some possible pathways to fixing all of this, right? To fixing the drop, the decrease in Black voter participation. I mean, so is that pretty much what you're saying? I mean, this is how to fix it, how to reactivate, return to that high level of Black voter participation that we had seen over decades.
Well, again, I think there's two sides to this story as well, right? One side being what can the Black community do to continue to engage politics in a useful and productive way at times when they feel alienated and they feel sort of left out in the mainstream political scene. And we're seeing a lot of community work and activism in other realms, less traditional modes of participating. We've seen boycotts take off and different ways to participate in protest action outside of sort of the traditional realm of politics. And that's a great way for the community to continue to exercise its political voice and power while also showing we're not necessarily happy with representation right now and we're not buying into the party politics. On the other hand, if the parties, say the Democratic Party, wants to get Black voters out to vote, right, all of the work I've done suggests that they have to meet Black voters where they are, especially those low propensity Black voters, unlikely voters who were on the fence last election and are really sort of checking out now. You have to meet them at a place where you understand why they might be disillusioned and disengaged instead of patronizing them and saying you don't understand the importance of politics. Take a step back and really help or you have to let them know that you understand why they might be disengaging and that the history of alienation and the history of exclusion from politics for the Black community plays a large role in that, especially for younger Black folk who don't necessarily have direct ties to the civil rights generation, don't have maybe parents or grandparents that have consistently told them about their lived experiences fighting for civil rights alongside the Democratic Party, right? These people need that extra push, that extra, okay, we see where you're at and we got you. And here's what we're going to do to help you push forward. And I think, for the party, one of the main things that the party can rest on right now is the idea that we're going to protect you from the Trump administration more than anything else. And that there's a step that has to be taken towards protecting what we've got before we can actually move forward and not jump the gun and say, oh well, we're going to do this, that, and the third for the Black community, when most of the Black community is looking at the Democrats like, even when you were in power and had majorities in the Senate and in the House, you were unable to do those types of things. So how should we believe you now? How are you going to do this in these times? And so the party really has to, again, meet people where they are, understanding their positions and push upon them. We need to support the Democrats to protect against Trump, come together as a community, show some solidarity to fight against this sort of authoritarianism and fascist regime that's trying to oppress Black people even further. And then we can move forward once we've staved off this attack on the Black community.
Yeah, just don't assume the reasons behind the disengagement. Actually ask questions about the disengagement, go from there. Real quick too, a lot of commentary about Black voters, some chunk of Black voters, particularly a significant block of Black male voters going over to the Republican Trump side. So was that really as significant as we assumed it was?
The data that I've collected suggests that it was not. Suggests
Okay.
that a lot of the talk out there about Black voters and specifically Black men peeling off and voting for Trump was just that. It was just talk.
Mhm.
That the people that are on social media um, caping for Trump and really propping up Trump are few and far between when it comes to the real world and the actual Black electorate. When looking at the percentage of Black men who supported Harris throughout the campaign, when she first joined the ticket in August, where our survey had about 63% of Black men support her. That number jumped up to about 72% in October, right before the election, ending at around 82% of Black men saying they voted for her in our post-election survey. And that's actually a few ticks higher than the 79% that exit polls have for Black men voting for Biden in 2020. And so again, this is a large misnomer sort of about all the talk of a racial realignment taking place this election with Black voters, where there was very little change in vote share when it comes to the votes that Harris got from the Black community compared to Biden 4 years later. Again, right, if we're going to talk about anything, it's going to be whether or not Black people actually turned out to vote.
Hey, so we got 2026 midterms coming up, and we have the presidential elections and others in 2028. So how critical will Black voters be? And this might seem like a simple, a simplified or, somewhat, some might say corny question, but I don't think it is. How critical will Black voters be in those elections?
Black voters are going to be extremely critical,
Yeah.
right, to push Democrats over the top, especially in some close statewide elections. We have Michigan Senate coming up, right? That's going to be one that's going to not only dictate sort of the majority or what happens in the Senate itself, but it could also have ramifications for the presidential election, depending on who's leading that state. And so, furthermore, Black people always play an important role in the Democratic primary elections. So looking forward to 2028 and who actually is on the presidential ticket for the Democrats, Black voters are going to have a large say in that, right? Especially as we look at states like South Carolina being moved up in the primary process the last couple election cycles. And so there's absolutely going to be an important role for Black voters. Again, it's going to be up to the Democrats to find ways to reach out to Black voters, to engage them and mobilize them effectively so that they're not still feeling like they're left out of the political discussion and sitting on the outside looking in.
Yeah, yeah. Um, you think we're headed to a new form of segregation, like a Jim Crow 2.0?
You know, I've written on this before,
Yeah.
and I don't necessarily think the entire country is headed in that direction. But when you look at the way that America was sort of on the edge of authoritarianism in the early 1900s, right, this sort of Jim Crow era, it was really more regional authoritarianism, where there were certain states that had one party rule, that were instituting segregation and Jim Crow laws, while other states were pushing in the opposite direction. And I really feel like the way that the country is polarized right now, that's the most likely outcome over the next 2 to 3 years, is that we're going to see some states really turn in towards authoritarianism and have more regional authoritarian regimes at the statewide or regional level, say the deep south, right? And we've seen this with Louisiana, states like Oklahoma, even Texas now pushing towards some very regressive and repressive legislation to keep people down, to make voting harder, to limit resources, to take away resources from education, where other states, right, are fighting back. And so states like California, Washington State, Colorado, states are, on the other hand, pushing in the opposite direction, trying to resist authoritarianism and what other states are embracing. So as a country, right, I think we're still quite a ways from being a completely authoritarian country, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some pretty powerful regional authoritarian regimes pop up in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I was about to ask too, can cities and states act as a bulwark of against, those that federal encroachment, right? I mean, what sort of tension or conflict will we see between the states or certain states and the federal government?
Yeah, I think cities and states absolutely can resist and fight back, and it's going to lead to an immense amount of conflict. But this again just highlights how important the midterm elections of 2026 are. When we have state legislatures up for election, we have governor elections in some important states across the country, state Supreme Court elections. All of these things are going to play a role in how and which states are able to resist continued pushes by the Trump administration to limit how states can move forward, to limit the resources states can use towards communities of color, specifically the Black community, and to really contain states who want to continue to push forward towards racial progress and a more democratic future, as opposed to other states who, you know, are looking at embracing the Trump policies.
Hey, do you and some of your other colleagues, do you explore how this could get that tension between cities and states, and then the federal government and other states, if it could get kinetic, right? Is that a worry or a concern kind of similar to how the Civil War started, back
Right.
in 1860?
I think there is a worry there, but it is still tempered by the fact that we do have elections right now,
Okay.
somewhat free and fair elections at the state level, and we'll see what happens in 2028 at the presidential level. But as long as we're continuing to have elections that are, for the most part, democratic, right? There's there's systems put in place to resist against continued sort of authoritarian pushes in different parts of the country, right? And if the majority of the country feels like we're moving too far in that direction, then we'll see a reaction in the midterms and in the 2028 election, right? Now, once we start to have questions about the actual effectiveness of our elections or the democratic nature of our elections, then it really becomes a dangerous situation where it's like, okay, if we can't even change things through the democratic process, if we're still sort of held hostage by regimes, even when the public wants to move in a different direction, that's a really scary situation to be in.
Yeah, and also, given the trends and the circumstances over the past few months alone, we got like a few years ahead of us, with many contending now that we are in the middle of a constitutional crisis as we speak, right?
Yes.
So, do we even think that there will be a 2028 presidential election? Like, what do we look like compared to other autocracies like Hungary, Turkey, India, and others, and elsewhere? How do we look right now? And are we going to? I hear that question starting to circulate. Seriously, I mean, do we even think there'll be a 2028 election?
I think in my circles, there's still this sentiment that we will have elections in
Okay,
2028 and beyond.
that's
There's
good.
questions about how free and fair they will be. Just a few days ago, Trump signed an executive order trying to add additional barriers to voting across the country by adding a citizenship requirement, a proof of citizenship, right? Which adds another hurdle for many people to get over, especially women who have changed their names or people who might not have matching documents or have ever had to prove their citizenship or have easy access to paperwork, right? So these things come into play. And we think these are going to be more of an issue in 2028 than actually not having an election. But there's also a good number of people who wouldn't be surprised if Trump finds a way to be the nominee again in 2028 and to, push back against this two-term limit for presidents and argue that he should be able to run again based on, visions of popularity or misinformation and misnomers about what the actual Constitution says. Again, this is all going to be sort of up to the courts over the next couple of years as well. And so far, the courts have been surprisingly steadfast in their constitutional view and not letting sort of Trump just do things at will that violate longstanding constitutional norms and precedents. But if there's a few more Supreme Court nominations in the next couple of years, that could very easily change.
Then we have to look at court enforcement. So
Yeah,
you can issue the orders, then how do you enforce them? I mean, the only thing sort of at the disposal of courts or federal courts is the U.S. Marshal Service, right? So,
yeah,
and it's like you can't have U.S. Marshals just like knocking on the door of the White House issuing a warrant. That's not.
right.
I don't know. It's kind of a dicey situation there.
Which is again why these midterm elections are going to be really important, because if a court order says you don't need proof of citizenship and you have a swing state with a Democratic governor, they're likely going to follow that court order, right? Where
Yeah.
if you end up with a swing state with a Republican governor who's more beholden to Trump, you might end up with someone who's less likely to follow the court order and more side with Trump. And so,
Okay.
what takes place the next couple of years is going to be really, really important in the future direction of our democracy.
Yeah, and going back to what you were saying, your level of protection is decided by where you live,
Right.
the space you live in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right now it is. And that's really an unfortunate place for the country to be in. It's a very sort of similar situation to the State of the Union following the civil rights movement, where there was uprisings, all over the country in places where the progress of the civil rights movement was stunted by continued um, discrimination and oppression, even in places outside of the Deep South. And so we're facing another turning point in our democracy.
All right. Thanks again, Professor, for your time. Professor Towler at California State University, Sacramento. That about wraps this episode. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer and host. A warm round of gratitude to our partner, the Civic Literacy and Media Influence Institute, for making this possible. Diane Ellison is executive producer. Raven Robinson is senior producer. Until then, find this episode and more while subscribing at thebnote.com. Thanks for watching.